Well, hi everyone, Shaun Humphries here. Welcome to All Things Retirement. Well, in this video, I'm going to have a conversation with Krista Clendenning, who's a lawyer with Traditional Law. Krista specializes in wills, powers of attorney, estate planning, trusts, and estate administration. So in this video, we're going to talk about on death what needs to be probated. If you're planning your estate, if you're an executor, having a general understanding of this topic, I think is important. So I think you'll enjoy this video. Now, if you're new to our channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future content. We provide content on retirement and overall wealth planning on a regular basis. So hit subscribe if you don't want to miss content, and click like if you like this video. And as well, if you want to reach out to Krista, if you require estate planning assistance, her contact information is in the show notes with this video. And finally, if you're within 5 years of retirement or already retired and you'd like to find out whether you're tracking in the right direction, you can find out how you can get a complimentary retirement planning analysis by visiting our website. In the show notes, you'll find a link to our homepage where you can get more information on that complimentary service. Okay, let's find out what Krista has to say about the probating process. So Krista, thanks so much for making time for us today to talk about another estate planning question. So the question I have for you today is, when do you need probate? And I know in my world, the question comes up, a lot of times probate's not required because through the operation of law, joint registration of assets, or beneficiary designations on insurance contracts or investment accounts, it's a pretty seamless, very easy process to do estate settlement. Typically, all we need is a letter of direction and a death certificate and a copy of the will, and it's done. But what gets more complicated is often in a last to die situation where you have now someone who doesn't have a partner anymore. It's usually kids, might be beneficiaries. There may have been a decision not to jointly register assets and not to have beneficiary designations on some assets. So probate often becomes a question. But I guess the general question is, when do you need probate? That might be one circumstance, but maybe you can cover the basic scenarios where you might need probate.
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the big ones is anytime there's real property. So, any real estate held by the deceased. As you mentioned, if you've got a house or a cottage or something that's held in joint names, and that is a true joint ownership where the property is intended to pass to the joint owner on death, then that joint property won't be part of the estate. So, you're dealing more so with that, if you've got a couple and it's the last to die of the couple, those properties are generally falling into that estate, or anything else in the deceased's sole name. Our land titles office will not transfer any real property to an executor, even an executor named in a will. If everything's signed up and done right, they will not transfer it unless you have a probate order.
Okay.
So that's one situation. I suppose another one, and one you'd be familiar with, is kind of the investment side. So we tend to see with different financial institutions, they'll have different thresholds of how much they will release to an executor without a probate order. And it seems to kind of vary from financial institution to financial institution. As a general rule, like I tend to see if something's over 20,000, even with a spouse, often it seems that they won't want to release those funds to a executor who is a spouse unless they have a probate order.
Interesting. Yeah, it's those kind of scenarios that get a little bit frustrating because it just seems to be a colossal waste of time and money to get small amounts, relatively speaking, dealt with that way. So when it comes to when you need probate, do you have any resources that you typically would direct people to? Obviously the first default would be talk to your lawyer that can guide you through the process. But are there resources at the Law Society or other spots that people can go to if they're in the situation where you have to consider whether they have to get probate or not?
Yeah, I think, your first step is always figuring out what the assets are, because until you know what the assets of the estate are, what's included there, you can't assess whether or not you can get away with handling your estate without probate. So if you are in that situation, as you mentioned, with spouses, it's quite common that you can avoid probate if things have been set up such that all the properties in joint names, most of the accounts are in joint names, and you may have beneficiary designations on your life insurance and tax-free savings accounts and RSPs or RIFs. So if you've got things set up like that, on that first spouse passing, most of it can all flow over unless there's some unique larger account or in a sole name or a specific asset that's just in that one spouse's name. Typically you can get away without obtaining probate. So first, is figuring out those assets. Can you proceed without it? But in terms of resources, I mean, the issue we have here is we've just gone through a huge overhaul actually of all of our administration forms and our rules. So on our end, we've been updating resource materials for lawyers for the Bar Association and making those available, but I don't think there's anything directly available to the public that kind of helps you walk through that. The court is, I think, meant to be there to kind of help people. I think you can go there to get assistance with obtaining copies of the forms, and they'll kind of walk you through the steps. But I think even us, we get rejected sometimes, but I think sometimes you just end up working through rejection after rejection until you get it right. So it can be a very frustrating process for people.
Yeah.
And there's just so many unique differences to different applications and situations, and whether it's administration because the person's passed away without a will, or probate order, and is it your executor that's your first name that can act, or an alternate, and there's other forms you need if that's the case. So it's not as straightforward as we would all like it to be, even me.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, wasn't that long ago there were probate fees in the province of Manitoba. Of course, I think probably a lot of other jurisdictions still have probate fees, likely. But, in the old days, people wanted to try to avoid probate to reduce those probate costs, right? So in today's environment where you have a situation where there's no probate fees, I think there's an argument that you would make as a lawyer that in a last to die scenario where there's multiple beneficiaries or children or gifting from the estate to charities, that it makes sense to have money go to the estate. The executor kind of ties everything up in a nice ribbon. CRA is looked after, any debts, and then distributions begin to happen. I think in a last to die scenario, that makes a lot of sense for the money to go into the estate, be subject to probate. It may take a little bit longer. There might be more administration, but it's likely a really good way of handling a last to die scenario. But in spite of that, people are often motivated by expediency. And have you seen any downsides? When a client says to me, you know what, Shaun, just register the asset and open account, now that Herb's not here anymore, just register with my 3 kids. And so it'll be me and my 3 kids as joint owners on this non-registered account. And, I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe many lawyers would go, well, okay, but understand at a practical level what you're actually doing. So what would your feedback be to a client, even when the relationships are pretty good, of what the downside might be to doing those kinds of joint registration with kids, as an example? Have you ever seen any stories that kind of send chills up and down your back?
Yeah, and exactly what you're saying. So in today's world here in Manitoba, we don't have probate fees, and we used to have that probate tax in place up to November of 2018. So people, I think, still have it in their mentality that I need to avoid probate. It's going to cost extra, and that's just not a reality here in this province right now. So yeah, it takes a little bit, but you can get a probate order in a couple months if you have the asset information that you need readily available. But yes, in this planning to avoid probate, one of the go-to things people will do is move assets into joint names. And so with joint accounts, any joint properties, whether it's real estate or accounts, the starting point is if that's a true joint ownership. Well, now you and your 3 kids, you're all equally joint owners. You all have a full interest in that property. If one of them goes through some creditor issues, those creditors can access that property. If they go through separation, that bank account will be treated potentially as a personal asset of them and brought into that family accounting. So also an issue there. And then even just with that parent who has been the contributor to that account, or the owner of that property, who's made all the mortgage payments over the year, they now can't sell the property or maybe close out the account or something without the sign off of the other joint owners. So it creates restrictions on their abilities to deal with the property. And when you talk about real estate, you add on a whole other layer of complication with taxes, because if you have a let's say, a home residence, so your principal residence, where as the parent, you may otherwise have a principal residence exemption and not have to pay any capital gains tax on that property when you pass. If you add your 3 children onto title in 2023, you're now changing the tax status of it. So you've got 3 more joint owners. You now can't use your principal residence exemption against the whole property going forward. And you've created a bit of a tax mess to sort out when you die or ultimately sell that property. So it's another one that people just totally miss and don't think about when they make these changes.
Yeah, that's a really good example right there. Yeah, so there's, the expedient. Okay, let's get it done. I think we all completely get that. But if it just takes maybe 2 or 3 months longer to kind of, tie everything up in a nice bow and do it properly, that's probably the best way to handle it.
Yeah, and I mean, the best thing you can do if expediency is what you want is keep good records about your assets or who to go to get that asset information. If you have, you work with different financial institutions, like who's the contact, and if you have all kinds of vehicles and properties, what's the value for the past tax year, like keeping track of all that. So when an executor ultimately steps in, they've got all of that readily at their fingertips. They'll be able to move forward with their probate application, which requires an inventory of the estate and valuations for everything. They'll be able to move forward with that much quicker, since that's usually the hang up for delay in those first couple months in putting things together.
Yeah, good point. Accurate record keeping is really helpful in those moments. Well, that's awesome, Krista. Thanks so much for sharing your insights today. I'm looking forward to our next series of talks on all things estate planning. You take care.
You too. Thank you.
Well, it's my hope that you found the conversation that I had with Krista helpful. And again, if you're looking for estate planning expertise and assistance, go to the show notes. You can find out the contact information for Krista and her law firm. As well, if you're within 5 years of retirement or already retired and you'd like a second opinion to confirm whether you're tracking in the right direction, show notes will have a link to our website where you can find out how you can get your complimentary retirement income planning review and forecast. And if you don't want to miss future content, make sure you hit subscribe. If you like this video, be sure to click like. Wishing you all the best in your retirement and overall wealth planning journey. You take care. Bye-bye.